Peter Kavanagh, and welcome to the series The Comforters, looking at Job chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. Why don't you have a look at that with me? When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, when they heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, that's Job, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. I want to unpack, just for a short time, some of the components of sympathy, or perhaps empathy, that we see here in the passage. Sometimes people think of sympathy as when you sort of feel sorry for someone, or you kind of feel for them, whereas empathy is when it's a bit more personal. You almost feel the same pain as that person feels or felt. Well, I'll probably use the terms interchangeably, but I do want to talk about that level of sympathy, which is really empathy, where someone else's sorrow becomes your sorrow. Someone else's pain becomes your pain. And I want to reflect that to give someone empathy, truly, for someone to feel in their agony or in their dark valley, that someone is suffering with them, at least as far as they can. I believe that is the most phenomenal gift that you can receive. I remember, I think it was last year, I had some bad news. And in my self-pity or wallowing, I thought, I want to tell people about my bad news. Well, I wanted some sympathy, didn't I? And so I remember telling 3 people about my difficulty. And I got 3 completely different replies. The first reply was from a well-meaning Christian person who wanted to give me some verses from the book of Romans that they thought might help me. Well, of course they were doing what was right, and of course the things written in the book of Romans are true, but that isn't quite what was going to help me, not in that exact moment. The second person replied, but in a different way. Didn't want to give me any advice, didn't want to give me any Bible verses, but instead wanted to tell me how rotten their life was. And in fact, that they were having a far worse time than I was. Well, much as I could feel sorrow for them, at that moment, that isn't what I wanted either. And then I got a third response from a third person, and all that person said was, I'm really sorry to hear that. Now, I don't know if you're anything like me, you'll know that it was that third response that perhaps helped me the most out of those 3 different responses. Just that sense that someone was with me, that someone was sharing in my pain, was in that moment, the very thing I sort of needed. And so I want to reflect that receiving empathy can be a wonderful source of comfort, and therefore, as much as we can, we must give as much empathy to one another as we possibly can. So I want to reflect on this. The first attribute that I want to show is that empathy is peaceful. It's peaceful. It says here, then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days, 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. One of the problems with Christians, it's our strength and it's also our weakness. Our strength is that as Christians, we believe we have many of the answers to life's problems. And our greatest weakness is, ready? That we believe we have many of the answers to life's problems. In other words, once you become a Christian, the danger is rather than being that nice, sweet, empathetic, kind, thoughtful person that you were before, now you're in danger of becoming an advice machine, a Bible machine that just regurgitates texts and promises of God and commandments and exhortations. And of course, it's not that those things are wrong. It's just that maybe that's not what would be required at that exact moment. When we look at this story, we see that as the friends got near to Joe, when they were finally with him, they could not speak a word. Their empathy was peaceful. In other words, it wasn't full of noise. It says they sat down with him for 7 days and nights and were unable to speak. I think one of the attributes of empathy is not vocal. It's just to do with proximity. It might be that, in eras of lockdowns and eras of social media and texts and all the kinds of ways that we communicate with one another today, that our proximity to people might be via that. It might not be a proximity that's a physical proximity. It might be that we just stay in contact with people. It might be that we just stay texting them or phoning them or just seeing how they are. But in all that proximity, I think the more we understand people's pain, the more we should feel that we actually have very little to actually say or advise. These friends had traveled, we don't know how, maybe hundreds of miles in order to comfort him. But when they got there and they saw the depths of his pain, they could barely say anything at all. Isn't that such, maybe I'll call it a British thing, maybe it's an international thing, that sometimes when we don't know what to say, when we feel like we haven't got any suitable answers to people's pain, sometimes we fall into the trap, I know I do, of not saying anything at all. One of my deepest life regrets is a friend of mine many years ago who lost a loved one, a real close loved one. And I just didn't know what to say. I felt I didn't have any clever advice. I felt like I had nothing that I could contribute, verbally. I felt that I had no words that would make any difference at all. And so I just kept away. I was scared. I felt a failure. I knew that I needed to comfort my friend, but I felt that I didn't have anything I could do. There's nothing I could say. And so I kept away. And it's a source of deep regret for me now. Because, well, I'm a bit older now. And now I realize that actually what people need is our proximity more than they need our wisdom, more than they need our clever explanations for why life has taken such a nosedive, particularly in their case. Now, as we see from the book of Job, Job's friends actually eventually start making the mistake of giving lots of advice. And in the end of the story, the Lord says to them that they had not spoken correctly, that they had said the wrong things. But at least they started off in the right place. Job himself says to them in Job 16 and these 5 verses here, he says, I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? I could also speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you. But my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. So, just 2 things to say about this. There's a famous old ancient saying, and it's this: a wise man once said nothing. Sometimes the wisest thing we can do is be there but not say anything, or not feel that we have to give the most phenomenal and exquisite answers to life's problems. You see, we're called to carry one another's burdens. We're not called to add to the burdens. And so if you have a friend in difficulty, or a family member, or someone in the church, or someone at work, let me encourage you to be there for them, but maybe take a leaf out of these friends' book here. Maybe say nothing, but just go and sit and be with that person. Carry the burden. Don't add to it. Number 2, I want you to notice what they did on purpose. When Job's 3 friends heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together, the NIV says here, by agreement to go and sympathize with him and to comfort him. This was something that they had chosen to do. I want to encourage us as followers of Jesus to make this part of our Christian discipline, to decide to spread comfort and sympathy and empathy as much as possible wherever we can. Galatians 6 verse 2 says that we are to carry one another's burdens. Now, we've already noted sometimes giving too much advice can add to burdens, giving people so many things to do. Well, what you need to do here, you need to pray about this, fast about this. Maybe you need to take communion every day. Maybe you need to dance around the bed in the morning, speak in tongues, pouring on a whole load of advice. Things that, by the way, that might be really good things to do. Maybe not dance around the bed. It depends how fit you are and agile and the size of the bedroom. But there are plenty of things that maybe aren't helpful to say at certain times. But we are to carry one another's burdens. It should be part of the DNA of the body of Christ. It should be part of the DNA of your church. That when people are struggling, that we should maybe be purposefully looking out for one another. And this is something that everyone needs to do, not just the leaders, the pastors, or the life group leaders, or whatever system you've got. It's not just about certain people who hold church offices or who have certain gifts that should do this. We are all told in the Bible to carry one another's burdens. Here's a great verse, Hebrews 13 and verse 3 says, "Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. It's clear that a church or a Christian community that has a as if you were DNA about them are going to be very, very powerful when it comes to looking after one another. 1 John 3 and verse 16, quite a well-known verse. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and our sisters. Well, this is something that must be done on purpose. Even Jesus didn't feel like giving his life. You remember Gethsemane. This isn't something he felt like doing. This isn't something that gave him excitement or some sort of spiritual endorphin to do. He chose to die. He willingly laid down his life. He gave his life as a ransom for many. And so sometimes laying down our lives, helping people, absolutely, it's time consuming. It's hard work. Sometimes we feel like we're not very good at it. Going and just having a coffee with someone or Zooming them or whatever may not feel like we're achieving much, but it can be very powerful to minister to someone's deep need. Remember what Jesus said, whatever you do for the least of these, you have done for me.